The Ukrainian and Russian delegations have concluded their negotiations in Istanbul, and despite all the farce staged by the Russian side, some results of these negotiations can still be summed up. Because after all, certain agreements have been reached. But I want to start with some rather wild statements from the Russian side, which suggest that the whole idea of the Kremlin regarding these negotiations was just another attempt to intimidate Ukraine and send a signal to the West about the fact that they are ready to fight forever, literally for years, even for decades. I want to start with the wild statements from the Russian side about how they are truly ready to fight forever. And that very representative of Putin, Medinsky, threatened the Ukrainian delegation, saying that some of your relatives and loved ones might die in the near future. He stated that if Ukraine does not agree right now to give Russia 4 regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, plus the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, then they actually want to seize Kharkiv and Sumy as well. They said that at the next negotiations there will be many more demands. And by the way, that same Medinsky stated that the condition for a ceasefire would be the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine from 4 regions, including those parts that Russia has never even occupied. At the same time, there is an agreement that Ukraine and Russia have agreed to present their vision of a possible ceasefire at the next round of negotiations. So there is an agreement that there will be another round of negotiations, most likely at exactly the same level. On the other hand, there is a statement already confirmed by the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Rustam Umerov, that both sides have agreed on an exchange of prisoners of war, 1,000 for 1,000. They haven't named the day yet when this will happen, but it should take place in the near future. Also during the negotiations in Istanbul, a meeting between the dictator Putin and President Zelensky was discussed. But in fact, it can be concluded that the historic day, which could have at least marked the beginning of negotiations to end the war, simply turned into a farce and confusion. Both delegations were driving around Istanbul, attempting to locate everyone. The Russian delegation itself set the time for the start of the negotiations. Then it was the one that was late for these negotiations, and so on. Let's, in this episode, summarize these negotiations together and state the specific positions of the Ukrainian and Russian sides, plus the statement from the head of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who hosted these negotiations. My name is Pechiy. Today is May 16th according to the calendar. Before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this episode, and leave a comment so that YouTube's algorithms will recommend this episode to as many viewers as possible. Also, subscribe to the Pechiy News on Telegram channel. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we promptly publish news as soon as it comes in. Now let's go over everything step by step. I'll start the episode with the wild, just absolutely wild demands from Russia, which once again tried to intimidate Ukraine and our Western partners. In particular, at the negotiations in Turkey, the Russian delegation threatened Ukraine that they could also occupy the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. The Russian forces are discussing occupying Kharkiv and Sumy regions before fully controlling Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. Correspondent Oliver Carroll writes about this on social media, citing his own sources in these negotiations. So, the Russian condition for a ceasefire is the complete withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk and Donetsk regions. As Carroll writes, quoting, Russia stated that it would agree to a ceasefire only if Ukraine withdraws. Of the 4 annexed regions, let's put annexed in quotes, which it doesn't even fully control, Moscow also threatened to seize 2 more, Kharkiv and Sumy. Next, Carroll quoted the head of the Russian delegation, Kremlin advisor, dictator Putin's Vladimir Medinsky, who stated the following: "We don't want war, but we are ready to fight for a year, 2, 3, however long it takes. We've fought with Sweden for 21 years. How long are you ready to fight?" Medinsky is addressing the Ukrainian delegation. The story with the Pechenegs is no longer relevant. Now the focus has shifted to the war with Sweden. He is also credited with saying that Russia is ready to fight forever. And Medinsky stated the following at the negotiations. Once again, this is a quote. "Perhaps someone at this table will lose more of their loved ones. Russia is ready to fight forever." Well, this is like an ultimatum saying that we are ready to keep fighting. No negotiations there will lead to anything. And by the way, this confirms what the Ukrainian side has been saying, that it's simply impossible to have adequate negotiations with the Russians for one simple reason. Because they are inadequate, Russia is not meant here. There was another rather amusing episode which that very Oliver Carroll mentions. And he quotes Medinsky, who says the following: Peter the Great, do you know who financed him? That England and France, Sweden would still be a great power today if it weren't for this. It's such a ridiculous attempt, like to convince the Ukrainian delegation that England and France, who are now our allies and who in Europe are the biggest supporters of strengthening sanctions against Russia, supposedly once they financed Pyotr Veliky, and this led to a war with Sweden. Well, in general, such nonsense, added Medinsky. However, the Russian delegation's idea is generally understandable, to try to intimidate and say that it would be better for you to surrender now because things will get much worse later. There are, of course, certain agreements. After all, it wasn't just a farce. There are small points of contact. In particular, that very one. The head of the Russian delegation, Vladimir Medinsky, stated after the negotiations that during the talks in Istanbul, the Ukrainian delegation proposed holding direct negotiations between the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. Russia took this into consideration. He also said that Russia and Ukraine agreed in Istanbul to present their vision of a possible future ceasefire and to outline it in detail. Next, I will quote Medinsky. After such a vision is presented, a ceasefire is implied. We also consider it appropriate, this has also been agreed upon, to continue our negotiations. Medinsky said Russia and Ukraine agreed to exchange prisoners on a large scale, swapping 1,000 prisoners from each side. Medinsky noted that overall the Russian side is satisfied with the result and is ready to continue contact. Well, it's also important to add here that the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Rostam Umerov, confirmed this information. It's true that during the Istanbul negotiations, a personal meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin was discussed. It was also agreed to exchange prisoners of war, 1,000 for 1,000, in the coming days. Umerov says that for now we will not name the date. He says that he knows it, but he will not announce it. It's obvious why. Because this exchange could fall through. In order not to jeopardize it, it's really better to keep this information quiet and announce it when the exchange has already taken place. But what's interesting is that now there's a reaction from Western media, Western analysts, and politicians to these negotiations in Istanbul. And probably the most telling reaction is the one where they say the following about the negotiations in Istanbul: a historic day turned into a farce and confusion. As the publication writes, expectations for possible negotiations in Istanbul were high. The meeting between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky could have truly been a turning point. However, the key figures did not show up, and the event turned into a diplomatic disappointment. In the media, they jokingly discussed where Vladimir Putin was. However, the hope for peace has not yet faded, writes Zelensky. He held a meeting in Turkey, but in Ankara, not in Istanbul, and not with Putin, but with Erdogan. Putin stayed in Moscow. And interestingly, he met with a banker and was engaged in non-public affairs. And later it became known that he dismissed General Oleg Solyukov, who commanded the Kremlin's ground forces. Trump, who had previously hinted that he would come in case Putin arrived, stayed in the Middle East and is actually returning back to Washington. No substantive negotiations took place today, it is written, even between the aides. Russia sent a delegation led by former Minister of Culture Vladimir Medinsky. According to Zelensky, its participation appeared symbolic and was merely for show. Moscow is once again pushing the conditions that were formulated back in the Istanbul Communique, the year 2022. Ukraine was supposed to give up NATO, disarm, adopt neutrality, and agree to guarantees, but with veto power for Russia. That is, security guarantees that can be vetoed by Russia as the aggressor that attacked our country. Ukraine rejected these terms, viewing them as capitulation. And here he writes that this could have been a historic day. One of the most important meetings since the meeting of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Iosif Stalin in Yalta in February of 1945. And further, I'll quote, "If Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Zelensky gathered together at a banquet table in the majestic Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul, it is quite possible that they could change the fate of Europe. Instead, it was a day of farce and confusion when none of the three leaders appeared in Istanbul, and the world press played a long game called 'Where is Vladimir Putin?' But despite the formal failure, European diplomats are not losing hope. They suggest that Trump is beginning to lose patience with Putin. And Putin ignored exactly the negotiations that he himself had initiated and rejected the call for a 30-day ceasefire. I think European diplomats may be overly optimistic about Donald Trump. According to the diplomat, such stubbornness on Putin's part could push Trump to support tough sanctions against Russia. Let me remind you that Senator Lindsey Graham has already proposed a bill with 500% tariffs for importers of Russian oil. He believes this could critically damage Russia's economy. Contrary to expectations, the United States president is not displaying a decisive response, which must be recognized. And that's why I'm saying that European diplomats are already too optimistic. And interestingly, when he was already flying home, answering journalists' questions on the plane, he said, "I'm not disappointed." Why should I be disappointed that Putin didn't come at all? Whether he will change his position is unclear, but predicting Trump's actions is generally a thankless task. Whether this was taken into account in Europe also remains in question, because today we will talk about this with you in the next episode. In Albania, Zelensky, Macron, Merz, Tusk and Starmer met. They talked, called Trump again, discussed something, and so far there has been no reaction from Trump. And out of respect, we should still acknowledge Turkey's position on these negotiations. The head of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Hakan Fidan, during the opening of negotiations in Istanbul between the Ukrainian and Russian sides, called for using the opportunity provided by the Istanbul peace talks to resolve the war in Ukraine. This is reported by Anadolu, the Turkish state media. According to Fidan, these talks were meant to arrange a future meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin. Well, and also during the speech at the opening of the negotiations. Fidan stated that Turkey considers it important for Russia and Ukraine to heed the calls for peace from United States President Donald Trump and his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Fidan states that the Istanbul talks should end with a Russia-Ukraine summit. Of course, it did not happen, but I will quote Fidan. Two paths exist. One leads to peace, the other to greater destruction. The sides themselves determine which path to choose. But judging by Medinsky's rhetoric, it's obvious that Russia does not accept the path of peace at all and does not intend to accept it. That's why it was a farce, but a farce aimed at showing everyone that Russia is ready to fight for years to come. It will not recognize any negotiations or make any concessions. And all these maximalist demands of Putin, they remain in force. And here the position of Donald Trump is very important, but unfortunately this position is becoming weaker and weaker, because Trump is already openly stating that, well, we'll see what happens. I flew home to take care of my own affairs, tariffs, to celebrate deals with the Persian Gulf countries. We'll return to the topic of Russia's war against Ukraine shortly. Trump said that he is ready to call Putin to talk about something, to arrange a meeting, and he believes that only during a personal meeting will they be able to agree on something. Here, friends, let me remind you, I've probably been repeating this for 2 months now on different broadcasts, not just on my YouTube channel. The main danger of Donald Trump's policy towards Putin was that Putin, first of all, believes that Trump is very interested in achieving a ceasefire, that the war should be stopped under any conditions. That is, Trump doesn't have any categorical position, he just needs a ceasefire. And realizing this, Putin continues the war and waits for more and more concessions, and Trump gives him these concessions. Trump's actions, though sometimes symbolic, collectively suggest he is prepared for various scenarios. For example, not imposing sanctions, even though he promised to impose them. Threatened, said, if I see that Putin doesn't want peace, I'll impose sanctions like this. Let me remind you, Trump repeated several times that in a week you'll hear my loud decision, then a week would pass, then another week and another week. And so, when on the eve Trump was asked how he would react to the fact that Putin didn't come to Istanbul, that the negotiations are not leading to anything at all, and that this is a complete farce, and that Putin just brazenly rejected the idea of a 30-day ceasefire, Trump said, well, I'll see. In a week, I'll tell you my reaction. And I said for 2 months exactly that the main danger of this policy is that Putin will insist in every possible way on negotiations with the Americans, that it is much more important to build bilateral relations, American-Russian relations. The issue of Russia's war against Ukraine can be put aside for now. And Putin is trying to achieve a situation where these relations between Washington and Moscow reach a level where Trump will not want to simply lower them again. These relations are for the sake of resolving Russia's war against Ukraine. That is, so that Trump doesn't say, my concern is that Trump doesn't say at some point like, listen, we have our own business to take care of. We're negotiating with the Russians, we want to sign some deals, and Russia's war against Ukraine is really getting in our way. So let Ukraine just surrender, give up, and we'll go on doing our own business, making deals and so on. That's where the huge danger lies. And unfortunately, my subjective opinion is that I see Trump pursuing just such a policy. He's not ready yet for any decisive actions. But I'll put an ellipsis here. Share your opinion and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to give a like.